Welcome everyone to our Solutions Engineering Hangout. My name is Nick Young and I'm a Solutions Engineer for HashiCorp based out of Southern California. And today for my topic, I chose, in the registration page, you guys saw migrating, but I changed the word last minute to upgrading Vault open source to enterprise with HSM integration. And the reason for that being, you're upgrading to a new set of enterprise features. Maybe you've been rolling your own in open source for quite some time. So we're not necessarily, just migrating the same thing to another thing. We're upgrading into an additional enterprise feature set. And I just wanted to share sort of some thoughts I had around that workflow and process. A little bit about the company for those of you that are new to HashiCorp. We were founded in 2012. We're just over 1,000 employees and well-funded. Oftentimes we're known more for our tool names than the actual company name at HashiCorp. And if you just wanted sort of like a one-liner as far as what each of the open source projects solve, I just kind of put together a quick slide that basically speaks through Vagrant, Packer, Terraform, Vault, Consul, and Nomad. My guess is if you're here to learn about Vault, you likely know about some of the other open source tools, but just also be aware that we do have enterprise offerings around specifically Terraform, Vault, Consul, and Nomad as well. But today we're focusing on Vault. And really the challenge is something that I've observed in my 9 months of being a HashiCorp SC, namely that in general, when prospects or Vault practitioners are looking to take advantage of some of the features HashiCorp has engineered in the enterprise versions, what I notice is the why is very well defined. We need, we need disaster recovery for our Vault cluster. It's business critical. It's in the path to our production environment. Maybe there's broad adoption. So you're leveraging enterprise features like namespaces so that you don't have to deploy separate Vault open source clusters and manage them separately per department or per team. Or maybe your company is mandating that, we need to adhere to certain compliance or governance requirements that can't be achieved in the open source version without some heavy lift of engineering effort. But the how is very vague as far as, maybe you've heard it from a HashiCorp employee before that you have to choose console or integrated storage, but the path to get from Vault open source on an open source storage backend to something like Vault Enterprise with console or recently released integrated storage is not very well defined, and it's not centralized in any one specific place. Now we have plenty of learn guides, and that's one of the things that I love about HashiCorp is that there's no shortage of content, right? As far as, how do you upgrade Vault? How do you deploy your first Vault cluster with console or integrated storage, among other things, but it can kind of feel like this, where there's a lot of information, but bits and pieces are sort of sprinkled throughout the HashiCorp website. And it's really hard to kind of hone in and understand, this is my thought process. I need to get Vault open source to enterprise because I need to take advantage of enterprise features, or I want to ensure that commercial relationship with HashiCorp and get that support from the guys who built the tool. But information is kind of everywhere, and I don't really understand how to get there. So the purpose of my webinar is to talk through an approach. I actually don't, on purpose, I don't have a demonstration or a demo in the sense of walking you through the command line and each step of the process, because there are guides that do that very well. My goal is to give you the overall sort of foundational level understanding that gets you from your world using Vault open source, using a backend that is not console or integrated storage, to that end result of getting Vault Enterprise using console or integrated storage. Just a quick disclaimer, and I put it in the registration page. This does not consider all of the nuances of your unique Vault deployment. And this is neither a deep dive into how to deploy Vault Enterprise or to set up HSM integration, since there are learn guides and videos for that. The whole goal is to really emphasize the foundational process that I think about when you're making this transition from open source to enterprise. And the last thing that I want to mention is this is not a replacement for something like a scoped engagement with HashiCorp's implementation services team or the help of a qualified partner. The way I see it, certainly you guys are intelligent enough to roll your own in Vault open source, but when it comes to just making sure that all your secrets and everything that you've built in open source doesn't somehow get lost or corrupted in the process, I highly recommend, you leverage the likes of a scoped statement of work through a qualified partner or professional services. All right. So with that, here's sort of the high level approach in sequential order. The first stage, if you will, is to migrate your Vault storage backend from whatever you use in open source to something like console or integrated storage, which is what is required when you're using Vault Enterprise. Migrate is an interesting word because you're not really moving or upgrading that backend, so to speak. You're actually copying the data from, in my example, I use DynamoDB. You're copying the data between that and console or integrated storage. The second stage, and there are 3 options here, is to upgrade the Vault open source binary from the open source binary that you download off of our website to the Vault Enterprise binary. And the reason I broke it out is because I want to give you guys the thought of, just different options and approaches, and leave you guys to discern, what would be the best approach for you. And I talked through some of the considerations around each of those options. Thirdly, you're going to deploy new servers if you need the HSM integration. And then I'll kind of talk through why we use DR replication and failover in order to achieve that. And then finally, and the last slide we'll talk through is going through setting up a DR secondary Vault cluster to protect your primary DR Vault cluster with HSM integration. All right. Some preparation, just some things to think about. Obviously, you want to take a backup, snapshot, whatever version of a backup is relevant to your storage backend in Vault open source. And throughout each stage of the process, you just want to make sure you stick to that backup methodology, just so that in the event something goes wrong, you sort of have a point in time snapshot to revert back to. I would also just take an inventory of the different auth methods, the secrets you have, the different secret mounts you have. Usually things like ACLs and Vault server related configuration you already have saved somewhere. And then thirdly, I'd say upfront rather than during the process, you want to consider whether you're going to choose console as your Vault Enterprise storage backend, or use Vault's integrated storage backend and then deploy the necessary servers as such. Fourth, you want to prepare your HCL file, which is part of the storage migration, or the copy, as I call it. And then the fifth thing you can do to prepare is obviously deploy the new servers on which Vault Enterprise or Enterprise with HSM integration is going to run. All right, so we're kind of talking through that first step. It's called migrate, but in my thinking, it's really more like a copy. The first step is to get you from, in my example, DynamoDB, which is an open source backend you can use for Vault, to something like console. You use this Vault operator migrate command, and you would pass in the configuration with your migrate.hcl file. One example of what it looks like is something like this, where the storage source stanza is all the attributes of your DynamoDB instance, and then your storage destination, or where you want to copy the data to, is in this case console. And this is what a real migrate.hcl file could look like. In doing so, it copies the data. And then within your terminal, you get an output that looks something like this, basically showing that it's copying everything from DynamoDB to console. And then from there, now you're at least on a supported backend. So that first part is now over. Now the next part is to think about how you want to upgrade your Vault open source binaries to enterprise. And this is where I break out the 3 options for that approach. The first approach is an Inplace Upgrade, in which you're basically replacing the existing Vault open source binary with the Vault Enterprise binary. And you're also installing Console Agent, which is just a best practice from HashiCorp. The key thing here is to make sure that you stop the Vault service first. And the first thing you want to do is basically move or remove the Vault open source binary. Since it's a single binary, you obviously know where it runs. And then the next thing is to add the Vault Enterprise binary, and also add and configure the console agent running in client mode, because this is how the Vault enterprise server is going to talk to the console backend. All right. And then with that, you want to make sure that you update your Vault service configuration. So it might look like this if I was looking at my open source Vault server. I'm just using sort of the paths based on what we have in our Learn guides. And you'll notice here that I have this storage stanza that's pointing to my DynamoDB backend for Vault. And then you basically want to modify that to change that storage stanza to console. And it almost kind of looks like that migrate.hcl file I showed earlier. So in modifying that, now you have Vault Enterprise talking to your console backend. So we can go ahead and start the Vault service. Unseal Vault using the quorum of key shares that you hopefully all have when you initially deployed Vault open source. You also want to make sure to apply your enterprise license key. And I say certain time because I noticed over the course of me being here, in some cases that when you guys purchase Vault Enterprise, the license is embedded with the binary, so there's actually no further action. In other cases, you have a time limit of 30 minutes or several hours to apply a license key. So at the time of this recording, usually you have a 30-minute time limit to apply the license key. Otherwise, you have to restart the clock and restart the Vault service. So just make sure you include the license key. And then finally, test your authentication methods. Try to add a secret and read out a secret and delete a secret. Generate some dynamic credentials. Just go through all the normal tests that you would expect a working Vault implementation should look like, and just making sure that your policies are all there, your secret amounts, and everything is as you would expect it to be. Some considerations with this approach. The good thing is that you have the consistency of data, because you want to do that copy as an offline process. You know that at this point in time, this is all the data that is pertinent and true. You can use your existing configuration tools. So we have plenty of customers using Ansible or CloudFormation or talk about Terraform to manage the administration of their Vault cluster. So because it's an in-place upgrade, it's the same Vault server. We just swapped out the binary essentially, but you can still manage Vault the same. And the nice part is that with only one active node being with only one Vault node being active at any given time, this avoids conflict. Some of the challenges though, as far as like rolling back, the changes are manual. You're looking at reversing everything that I just showed you. And this can kind of create delays in downtime if the migration process fails. So just something to consider. The next approach, call it 2B, is deploying a new Vault Enterprise cluster with the console backend. So whereas before we did in-place upgrade, in this approach, we're deploying new servers with the console backend. And this is what that approach will look like. So you basically are deploying new Vault Enterprise servers. So now you still have your Vault open source cluster. You're deploying new Vault Enterprise servers. You basically just use this configuration to point to console as your storage backend. And then this is a key step too. You want to stop your Vault service running on Vault open source, and then start the Vault service running the enterprise binaries, right? And then the same thing, unseal Vault, apply your license key if it applies to you, and then test, right? So that one's pretty quick just because I kind of showed you most of the grunt work is with the in-place upgrade. In this approach of deploying a new Vault Enterprise cluster, some of the pros, there's a quick cutover. So as I showed you, you basically stop the service on one and start it on the other. I'd highly recommend for the consistency of data that you stop it, you kind of do it during a maintenance window. But in this process, the cutover is very quick. You sort of have the option to revert back to the Vault open source cluster in the event the new one is not working as you expect it. And the Vault open source cluster remains largely unchanged. Trade-offs. There's potential conflicts in the event somebody accidentally fires up both open source and enterprise clusters, because then that means you have two active nodes. There could be inconsistencies of data because there are two sources of truth, and that can be confusing. Reconfiguring the Vault open source server. This is more of like a suggestion as far as keeping your, in my case, the DynamoDB inaccessible, but not deleting it necessarily, but just making sure nobody accidentally points to that, fires it up, and makes changes to that backend that they shouldn't. And you also have to modify your existing configuration tools. So you have to change your your VIP, your FQDN, the IP address of your new Vault Enterprise cluster. And if you're using Terraform, you'd have to use the Vault provider to point to that new Vault active node. So just there's always trade-offs. There's not one that's better than the other. The approaches are just different. So I bring all this up for your guys' consideration. And then the third one, option 2C, is to deploy, again, new Vault Enterprise clusters, but with integrated storage. So in 1.4, we announced the general availability of Vault with integrated storage. So for those that don't want to manage console as a separate storage layer, just to support Vault, you could basically use the embedded storage using Raft within the Vault servers themselves. So in this model, kind of the same thing. You're basically going through that same Vault operator migrate command. You'll notice here that instead of the storage destination being console, I'm basically pointing to Raft. And then it's going to copy the data to the Vault Enterprise server, which has its storage embedded within it. And then the process after that would be something along the lines of adding follower nodes. So assuming that the one that you copied the data to is the leader, you would add 2 follower nodes to the cluster using these commands and just basically pointing to the API address of the Vault leader. And then with that, you have your deployment complete for Vault Enterprise using integrated storage with at least 3 Vault nodes. Okay. All right, so if your goal is to get to Vault Enterprise, you're done here. If you don't need HSM integration, you're sort of done at this point. If you need an HSM integration to adhere to your company's compliance requirements or customer requirements, then this is sort of that section to talk through how you get to Vault Enterprise with HSM integration. The process is different than everything I just outlined earlier. And it really starts with the Vault binaries. If you've ever been on our release website, you might notice that in our latest release 1.5.0, we have different versions, if you will, of the Vault binaries. This just kind of outlines, this is the open source version, this was the enterprise version, and then there is a separate binary for Vault Enterprise with HSM integration. So just something to keep in mind as far as what the different file names mean. It's also prudent to just check in with your HSM's documentation. I pull up Amazon because they have very clear guides on how to deploy your first Cloud HSM using the Amazon Web Service. Kind of goes through all the things that you need to install on the Vault server itself. But in this case, they use, there's a Cloud HSM client that you have to install on the server that's going to be talking to your HSM. So let's say, I'm just kind of simplifying the diagram. Let's just say we have our Vault Enterprise implementation and it's in production and it's rolling well. What you would do in this case is you would deploy a separate Vault Enterprise with the HSM binary as a separate cluster and have that integrated with your hardware security module, whether that's on-prem or in cloud. And then the next thing you would do is you would set up disaster recovery replication, which is an enterprise feature. It's not something that you would find in the open source version. And in setting up disaster recovery and replication, you would establish your now Vault Enterprise cluster as what's called the DR primary. And then you would set up the Vault Enterprise with HSM integration as your DR secondary. So replication is basically flowing from left to right on the screen as you see. And then the next part is to basically promote your DR secondary cluster so that it becomes your new primary. And in doing so, you either want to demote your old primary or you want to disable replication entirely, assuming that all of the data has been properly synced over to your new Vault Enterprise with HSM integration. And now your Vault Enterprise with HSM is now your new DR primary, right? Just a couple things to consider as far as the behavioral changes when you're using the hardware security module. The biggest change is, as you guys are all familiar with in open source, you basically go from using the Samir secret sharing algorithm where you have a quorum of key shares, and collectively, if you have that quorum, it rebuilds the master key, which is then used, it rebuilds the master key, which is used to protect the encryption key within Vault. That changes to where now the HSM has the responsibility of doing that. And I included a link at the bottom just to go through the document that explains how those behaviors change, and just some of those things to consider if you go the route of using the HSM integration. And then finally, the last step is to deploy a new DR secondary Vault Enterprise HSM cluster. And the primary reason for that is really around considering this deployment methodology, deployment topology, in that if you have Shamir as your primary Vault cluster, then you can have any mix of Shamir or HSM or KMS unseal methods in downstream Vault clusters. If your HSM is your primary, if your Vault cluster with HSM integration is your primary Vault cluster, then downstream, you want at least other clusters that have either HSM or Cloud KMS to auto unseal your Vault cluster. In the event you have a downstream Shamir cluster, it's now a negative security practice to take that approach, but technically not something that anybody could stop you from doing. And the whole idea, the whole reason why you buy an HSM or you leverage a Cloud KMS is because you trust that, right? And then if you kind of leave it back into the hands of humans, whereas upstream you have your primary Vault cluster integrated with your HSM and unsealing it as such, it creates a security risk in that model. So in this model, you have now your DR primary, which is your Vault Enterprise with HSM binary integrated with your hardware security module. You deploy your DR secondary using that same method with a different HSM, or you could leverage the likes of, and I'm going to just use AWS. You could use AWS Cloud HSM or Cloud KMS to auto unseal that cluster. And then finally, you would establish a disaster recovery replication. And now you're basically into a state where your deployment is complete. And in this case, if I just pretended that your primary was running on-prem and your DR secondary was running in cloud, this is one way you could set up that deployment topology in a way that is compliant to that security topology, and still ensures that your primary cluster has a disaster recovery cluster in the event something goes wrong, in this example, with your on-prem environment. All right. So with that, I didn't intend to take the entire hour. Again, I think plenty of people are probably feeling a little burned out from virtual Zooms and virtual conferencing for the last 5.5 to 6 months. So I want to keep it short, leave it open to additional questions if you guys have any. And I just want to thank you guys for sharing your time here. So with that, Ali, do we have any questions in Q&A?
Yeah, let's see here. We don't have any questions yet. If you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A. It's the tab, or on the bottom tab. You can enter your questions in there or in the chat as well. We can wait a minute.
Sure.
Can we use operator to migrate from OSS to OSS?
I believe you can. I haven't tested that use case because generally when I'm talking to a prospect, they're looking to get into the enterprise versions of our products. I would imagine, let me circle back to an earlier slide. Let me see if I can find it. I would imagine it falls into the realm of just configuring this file where your storage source is one open source backend and your storage destination is another open source backend. I haven't tested it though, so I can't say for certainty. I just understand that this mechanism is used for copying data from one backend to another. Sure.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions? Everyone will receive this recording tomorrow in a follow-up email. So make sure to look out for that. And then I'll include Nick's information as well. He's sharing it right here on his slide. But I'll include his email. So if you have any additional questions, comments, needs, he's more than happy to help.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Hopefully it was short enough, succinct and concise enough that it just gave you guys some idea of understanding. But if you guys have additional questions, feel free to email me directly. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Nick.